Okay, so is there a launch date for V2 to throw in the calendar? No hard date, no. Because for one, we're still not entirely finished everything that we're working on, and I'm sure I'll get into everything we are working on some throughout this AMA, and there's also other things that we're going to need to do that are somewhat outside of our control. So things like we'll run test nets, and if there's issues, then we can't just launch. We're going to have to fix those issues, and then also we're going to have to get audits done, and that's at the mercy of whatever audit firms are doing their timelines, their lead times, all that sort of thing. So yeah, we can't commit to a date, but we are making good progress, and we're hopeful to get the work done on our end to start the test nets in early September sometime, and then run the test nets, get audits done, whatever. Then we can commit to a more concrete date. But yeah, we're talking a month, 2 months maybe. That seems a stretch though, but it's not going to be a year away. Is there a contingency plan if the protocol, God forbid, fails after a few days like V1? I mean, it's a good question. So we're obviously designing as much as we can to avoid those kinds of issues. So the specific issues in V1, which was the unbonding issue, which I'm sure most of you are aware of by now, but that unbonding issue was caused due to various complexities in the way that the vesting calculations happened, and yeah, we didn't write that code especially well because of the various complexity. The V2 design has completely overhauled that. So instead of just fixing the bug, we've designed a completely new system that simplified the complexity by over an order of magnitude for sure. I was mentioning to some of the team that it took probably around 3 weeks to write that vesting code for V1, and even at the end of that time, we still weren't particularly happy with where it was at. But it was just one of these that we could spend years on this if we don't just put it out there. And unfortunately, we did put it out, and there was issues. But the V2 code, the vesting contract was written in about 2 hours, and that's to illustrate the reduction in complexity that's involved in those contracts for V2. So hopefully less complexity is less surface area for issues, and obviously we're going to be as rigorous as we possibly can before we launch. So we're hopeful that there's not going to be issues like there were in V1. And another thing as well with the V1 is that we had no emergency withdrawal on the liquidity mine, which if we had that, we could have deployed a new liquidity mine, emergency withdrawn all the LP, put it into the new liquidity mine, and just went from there. And there wouldn't have been as big of an issue. The issue came because we didn't have that withdrawal, and the funds were locked. So obviously we're going to have a withdrawal, an emergency withdrawal on the V2 contract. Again, it'll be behind a time lock, so we can't abuse that. Or if for some reason we decide to, the community will have 3 days to see what we're up to and take their funds out before the time lock executes. So to that end, we're hoping that will be enough to mitigate as much of the risk as possible of the failures. And then in terms of specific contingencies, if we do fail, again, I mean, we can't build in too much there. We'll have treasury funds again, and God forbid, like we'll deploy those again if we need to. But I really hope we don't have to this time. I recalled that there's going to be early access for compensated users. Is that still the plan? So the specific plan that we laid out was anybody who was compensated would be on a whitelist, and that still stands. And the whitelist so the gray area is considering what happens with everybody else who wasn't compensated. Maybe they made profit in V1, or they just weren't eligible for the compensation. what happens to them, because those are people who supported us in V1, and if they want to come back for V2, then that's loyalty, and we want to reward that in some way. We just haven't decided specifically how, or whether we will or not. But yeah, the people who are compensated for sure will be on a whitelist, and that whitelist will get some kind of early access, or probably something much similar to what we did in the V1. We had a community offering for V1 where people who were in the Discord before we launched V1 were able to pledge a small sum towards the initial liquidity of the protocol, and they got bonded automatically, so they were earning yield from time zero, and it was all done automatically for them. So something along those lines is probably what we'll do for V2. Is there any more? So I suppose while we're waiting for some questions, I'll just run through some of the stuff that I outlined in the teaser article that I put out. So I've touched on it a little bit, this focal vesting idea, which is the redesigned version of the vesting that we had in V1. And as far as we're concerned, vesting is a critical part of the protocol, and the V2 is still going to have like that vesting idea, and there's even going to be the potential for that vesting period to be dynamic, which can also have various additional benefits to the protocol. If we extend the vesting period, then the amount of capital retained by the protocol is higher, and the pain of leaving and unbonding and forfeiting your unvested reward is increased. So at times where the protocol is potentially struggling, maybe the TVL is growing quicker than than we would like, or the APY is extremely high and we think that's unsustainable, or there's a lot of money being pulled out of there's various things that could be going on there, and we could potentially change the vesting period to retain more capital. But that's as it stands right now, that's not something V2 can do, but the new architecture will allow that in a way that V1 wouldn't. And the impact to the end user in the new vesting system is negligible. So in V1, the vesting was just a strict 24 hours. As soon as a reward was generated, which is the point that the stabilizer mints new malts and sells it into the AMM, when that happened, that profit is immediately distributed to LPs and then vested over 24 hours from the point that it was created. And the problem with that is that the rewards could come in at any time, any place, and we had to keep track of all of that because the vesting would then be from 24 hours after that point. And at any given point in time, there's potentially hundreds of rewards that have come in different instances, and they're all vesting over 24 hours. So we've got to keep track of all 100 and who was in the protocol, who was bonded. Like if the reward comes in now and somebody else comes in 12 hours, the person who came in 12 hours isn't eligible for any of the reward that came in before they bonded. So we have to keep track of all of that, and that's where all the complexity lay in V1, and that's ultimately what led to the bug. And the focal vesting is, as the article outlines, this idea that any rewards come in at any point, all vest towards a specific focal point, as we're calling it, in the future. So that focal point could, for example, be midnight every night. So then if we're like here at Tuesday, anything that comes in, any rewards generated anytime during Tuesday, excuse me, any rewards that are generated during Tuesday vest midnight on Wednesday. So then in that example, the maximum vesting period is 48 hours, and that would be if a reward was generated in the first block after midnight Tuesday morning. And then that would vest on Wednesday evening, midnight, which that's a 48-hour period. And then the shortest period of time that it could vest over is if the reward came in one block before midnight on Tuesday night. And then that would vest over 24 hours. And then that would average out in some way, and it would approximate some kind of like V1-esque linear vesting, but it's just significantly easier to keep track of the bookkeeping with this focal idea. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we can change that focal distance, and it would come into effect immediately after we tick over to the next focal area, and that would give us a bit more flexibility if required. So has the future focal point been decided? 2 days. So we're probably going to have a focal point every 24 hours, which would be what I've just illustrated, where the focal points are every 24 hours, and then the maximum focal length is 2 days, or 48 hours, and the minimum is 24. So in that sense, it's going to be very similar to the kind of vesting periods we saw in V1, just with significantly simplified code. And so then moving on from that, that's the reward focal, the vesting period for rewards for V2. And another thing that we're doing is smoothing out the rewards. And this is in response to a few things that we noticed in V1. So one very surface level thing is that people got confused when the APR started fluctuating. And the big part of that was that the APR that was quoted on the UI was just the implied APR of the last epoch, the last 30-minute period. And because the APR generated in that epoch is related to the amount of purchasing of malt that happened during that epoch, it fluctuates a lot. So if one epoch there's just a ton of buying, maybe a big player was taking a position, then the rewards generated in that period are much higher, and then maybe there's another epoch that doesn't have very much purchasing happening and the rewards are lower. So that was a problem in the UI, and we could solve that by just showing an APR in the UI by averaging over more epochs than just one, maybe the last 12 epochs or 24 epochs or whatever it happens to be. And in doing that, we would smooth out the APR quoted in the UI, and that would be less scary for people. They wouldn't see sudden drops in APR, and that was scary for people. So we could do that, but we chose not to do that because that is just, in some sense, masking the problem. And the problem ultimately is that we don't control the emission of rewards, because the emission of rewards is completely tied to purchasing of malt on the AMM and then ultimately stabilizing the resulting price that comes from that activity. So what we're doing this time is running the rewards through what we're calling a throttling contract, which will try to approximate a given APY. And in some sense, you can think about this like the reflexors RAI, the reflex index, where there is this kind of PID system where it's trying to find a market-driven set point for the stablecoin in the case of RAI. We're going to use a similar PID kind of system for the way that the APR is calculated. So the APR will be market-driven in that it will fluctuate up and down based on the market activity in malt. But the way that it does that is by throttling down the total rewards generated. So to give a concrete example, if $1 million of DAI is created in a given epoch as reward, maybe 400,000 of that is just given out as reward and vested using the focal vesting, and the remaining 600k is put into an overflow bucket. And then let's assume, for the sake of argument, that no more people bond, and then the following epoch we're going to aim for another 400k of rewards. And if 400k comes through the market and naturally generates, then the 400k is given out, and the overflow goes into the overflow bucket again. But if we get to an epoch where there isn't enough reward to come through to make up that 400k, maybe there's only 200k comes through in a particular epoch, then we will pull 200k out of the overflow that's been accruing, and give that as reward to bolster that reward up to 400k. And in doing that, we're actually smoothing out the reward over time by taking surplus from epochs of abundance and using that surplus to drip back in during lower activity epochs. And that has multiple benefits. So one, we can make certain guarantees about APY because we know that there's a certain amount in overflow. There's like we could say there's $10 million hypothetically in this overflow contract. So we know if we're trying to sustain 400k of rewards or 500k say of rewards per epoch, we know that we can sustain for 20 epochs guaranteed, even if there's no activity on malt. And that means that during times of contraction where the demand is potentially drying up, we can still provide rewards, which reduces the need or the desire or the incentive for users to leave the protocol, because they know that they're going to get some rewards because we've got some there. So we're not always relying on market activity. We are genuinely smoothing out those rewards, so that there's a great benefit to that. And then another benefit that is really the deepest insight and the kind of biggest thing that we're working on inside V2 is this idea of implied collateral. So implied collateral is, so in V1 we had liquidity extension. In V2 we will have the same thing, and a mistake that we made in V1 was that the amount of liquidity extension that we had was too low. So immediately we'll boost that up. Let's say 50-60% liquidity extension initially. So that means in a traditional sense we're collateralized 50-60%. So for every one malt that exists, there is 50 or 60 cents of collateral in liquidity extension, and that's the traditional sense of what collateral means. But then within malt V2, we're going to have this overflow pool, and there's going to be a few other areas where this comes into effect, but I've just explained the overflow pool, so we'll use that as the example. That's money that's set aside to give users reward, and it will be given out as reward. But it's also not given out yet. So it becomes a secondary layer of collateral that the protocol could use if it really needs to. So that's why we're calling it implied collateral, that in the worst case, we can add liquidity extension plus overflow plus a few other things that we've got together to give a larger implied collateral. So if we're 60% collateralized using a traditional collateral method, and then we have like a ton of money in the overflow, we might actually have an implied collateral of 100% or more. And if we have an implied collateral of 100% or more, there's various guarantees that we can make that typically cannot be made in under-collateralized coins. So we could, if really forced to, just do a full buyback with the money that we have available to us to restore PEG. And that would circumvent the need for any kind of auction mechanism. And that's not to say we're not going to have that auction mechanism. We are for V2. But V2 is going to have these stronger, more robust mechanisms with implied collateral that will allow us to operate with higher levels of guarantees than we could ever have made in V1. And we are hopeful that if we start with a lot of collateral, so we start with a high liquidity extension percentage, and then we start to accrue up these other sources of implied collateral, it will allow us to weather the period of adoption before we have utility. And this is another point that people have brought up a lot with Malt V1 and various stablecoins outside of Malt as well, is that a stablecoin is only useful when it has utility. It cannot be a farm forever. And our desire has never been to be a farm forever. We need it to be a stablecoin with utility. We need you to be able to borrow it, lend it out. We need it to be able to collateralize like on-chain options or whatever else, whatever other use cases you may have for a stablecoin. We need to have that. So we need to be adopted by other platforms within DeFi for us to be useful. But then that leads to this catch-22 situation where we need use case, but for any other protocol to give us use case to adopt Malt as part of their protocol, they want to see Malt be stable. So then for us to become a good stablecoin and be stable over time, we need utility, but the utility needs us to be stable before they'll integrate us. So to avoid that, as many people have pointed out, it would be sensible for an algorithmic stablecoin to start off fully collateralized, because then at least you can make these guarantees of stability without needing to quote unquote prove your mechanism, get those integrations, get the utility, make the coin useful, and then over time decentralize further, improve decentralization of governance and of the token itself, and reducing the collateral that's required. And a discussion that I had a few days ago, it was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it illustrates the point that this is exactly what the US dollar did. It started off on the gold standard, and it was fully collateralized. And then over time, they just abandoned the gold standard, and they're a zero collateral coin now. But it works. Debatable in these circles, but to my point, it's still used as a currency, and they were able to do that because they had the utility. It was already the global reserve currency when they left the gold standard, so they were able to make these kind of fiat guarantees even though they had no backing value. And while that analogy is a little tongue-in-cheek and is a little a bit more abstract or whatever, but the concept stands, and we think that may be the best way to approach algorithmic stablecoins. And I'm just seeing a question here that, so will for a period of time in the beginning Malt be redeemable 1-for-1 for DAI? Probably not, actually. We still don't think there's going to be a redemption and minting mechanism. Well, there's definitely not going to be a minting mechanism external. There may be a redemption mechanism at the liquidity extension ratio, which just provides a little more confidence that we can sustain a floor for the price of Malt, which if we have 60% collateral, we can guarantee a 60 cents price floor for Malt. And that has various benefits for like the confidence in the market that there is actually a price floor. And we saw that with iron. When Titan went to zero, iron were able to guarantee the price of iron at, I can't remember, 74 cents or something like that. So yeah, we'll probably allow a redemption at liquidity extension ratio to guarantee a price floor. But in terms of being directly redeemable, we don't think so for V2. But if we do have implied collateral of over 100%, then the protocol itself internally can carry out actions that will guarantee a dollar peg, which is the advantage of being fully or over collateralized. And then over time, we can tweak the parameters, lower the liquidity extension, and then we get all of the benefits of being under collateralized. So in the case of like a fully, let's suspend disbelief for a second and say that Malt had zero collateral, so it had zero liquidity extension, and it was just holding peg, then all profit ever generated by stabilizing the coin goes to LPs, because there's in a fully collateralized coin, any of that money has to, anytime Malt or any of the stablecoin is minted, you need the backing value as well. So in the stabilization of Malt, most of the money generated by doing that would have to go immediately into the collateral if we were 100% collateralized. And if we're 0% collateralized, none of it has to go into collateral, so it can all be distributed as profit. And doing that initially isn't a good way to go about it, and I think we discovered that in V1, that we were drastically under collateralized for what we really needed in V1, and that was a mistake on our part. But yeah, we think we've learned from that, and we're not completely giving up on the idea of being algorithmic at all. We still think that the most valiant thing you could ever aim for in DeFi is to have a good under-collateralized algorithmic stablecoin, because that would allow for the most decentralization. And in DeFi, the most decentralized system should win over time. And for stablecoins, it's a big talking point right now that there's centralization with USDT, USDC. DAI is coming under question because of how much USDC backs it. And these are things that can be shut down by regulators, and they can just be controlled by central authorities. And we don't want that as a collective ethos in DeFi. So the most decentralized systems should win over time. And being algorithmic is the best way of, in our mind, of ensuring some kind of decentralization. So we've got any more questions? If not, I'll just keep rambling, because apparently that's what I can do. So I suppose another thing to mention actually is the ARB token escape hatches, which in V1, this was squarely on my shoulders, but I naively thought that the ARB tokens simply offering a better premium or any kind of premium above the market price of malt would be enough to incentivize people to purchase those tokens. So for example, if the current malt market price was 80 cents and you could buy an ARB token for 70 cents, then you would. And that was naive on my part, because what I wasn't factoring in is the risk profile of that proposition. And swing trading has a better risk profile because you can get out at any point. So if you buy at 70 cents and it drops to 65 and you want to get out, you can just accept a loss. And if it goes up to 80 and you think it's topping out and that's going to be it, you can get out at a small profit and be done. Where the ARB tokens were, in a sense, an infinite time horizon binary option. So you either made the premium or you lost everything, but you had forever to realize it. So if it ever got back to peg, you would be you would get your premium, and if it never went back to peg, you would lose everything. That kind of risk profile was profoundly disadvantageous for the ARB tokens. And while the underlying mechanism did work to an extent, in that when we first lost peg, we sold off quite heavily, and then once the selling had subsided, the ARB tokens actually brought us back to the high 90 cents. And then we saw like the various swing traders and the bots that were just leeching value out of the liquidity extension, and that resulted in a little too much sell pressure, and then we couldn't return to peg and we lost it again. When we lost it the second time, that's when we shut everything down. And then obviously there was the bugs as well, which compounded all of the issues. So to that point, the ARB tokens are, in V1, had a disadvantageous risk profile. So we want to change that for V2 and allow ways of users to get out of ARB tokens. But then we have to design a system where they can't just be swing traded and we're just pushing the problem from the AMM into the ARB tokens, where they're still getting aggressively swung trade, and there's nothing much we can do about that. So what we're thinking about, and we haven't actually implemented this yet, we're still in the thinking phase, is that if the market price drops below the point where you purchased the ARB token, then you will be allowed to sell at whatever that loss is. You can just realize the loss in just the same way, and you'll be paid back in your DAI or whatever other token that it was, if it's a different pool. But if it's a Malt DAI pool, you pledge DAI into the auction at 70 cents, and then the market price drops to 65 cents. You can get out at that 5 cent loss per token, and you will just be paid back in DAI. And doing so it improves the risk just in and of itself. And then on the upside, we're not going to allow you to cash out your full profit, because if we did, that just allows swing trading to happen. for you to get your full profit, including all premium, is if malt returns to peg. But if, say, you bought malt at 70, or you bought ARB tokens at 70 cents, and the current price is at 85 cents, you could realize a smaller profit than the full value of that swing trade in its current state. And that will allow people to get out, and it will also allow us to realize a supply contraction from what you did. So you made a small profit, and the malt supply has shrunk because of that. So malt has been benefited by that, and you've made a little bit of profit, which means that you don't, if you think that we're not going to return to peg, you can actually get out and have still helped the protocol in some way by contracting the supply, even if it's just a little bit. But the aggregated sum of everyone doing that should have a big impact. And then for those who do believe that malt will return to peg, they can hold, and if it does return to peg, they will be duly rewarded. And yeah, so that's, I mean, there's not much more to say about that. It's just adding in these additional features that will impact the risk profile of being involved in those arbitrage auctions. Yeah, liquid losses, illiquid profits. It's a succinct way of putting it. I like that. Yield farms are increasingly getting killed by whale scalpers, like what happened to Dino. Are there any measures to combat swing trading? Yes. But I'm not going to go into too much detail because it might be our secret sauce. But we do have a plan. But you are right. Swing trading I think this is something that Felipe has been speaking about a lot, where he talks about how the above peg mechanism in malt is strong such that there isn't a lot of activity trying to swing it above peg. So there's not a lot of people that we could see, at least, not that we did a particularly rigorous analysis of this, but there weren't that many people buying at peg expecting to be able to swing it above peg and sell it higher, because the stabilizer worked really well and brought the price back in line pretty regularly, and even the max deviations were never that high. Once we got to a certain level of liquidity, it was like maybe over $10 million of TVL in the pool, we almost never saw the price deviate above $1.03 or something. And when it did, it was there for very short periods of time because the stabilizer kicked in and just brought it straight back down to peg. So in that sense, we disincentivized swinging because the mechanism was strong. And then it's on us to try and think about, well, how can we make it such that the same incentives exist below peg, where it's just like, there's just no point even trying to swing this because it's just not going to work. It's actually more profitable and better risk for me to just participate in the core mechanism itself. And that's a big question to have to answer, and we're doing our best, and we think we've come up with some decent ideas, and yeah, we'll have to see when we roll V2 out. We'll see if it works. I hope V2 can be like Tomb with high APR and there will be no death spiral. I mean, yes, me too. That's exactly what all of us want, I think. And yeah, we're trying our best to make that happen, but I suppose it depends on how you define high APR. For some people, high APR is 10%, but I suspect that's not what you're looking for. But yeah, I do think that reasonable APRs will be possible within the context of DeFi level APRs. And yeah, no death spiral. That's down to mechanism design. And I think like V1 failed, but not necessarily because of the mechanism itself. It was just a pure coding error. So there's a difference in my mind between there's a fundamental error at the protocol level versus the implementation wasn't good enough. There was a bug in the implementation. Bugs in the implementation can be fixed. Bugs in the core protocol the like fundamental issues in the protocol, they're harder to fix. And yeah, so I think for V2, we're simplifying a lot of the code. So the surface area for implementation bugs is significantly smaller, and we're like doing our due diligence and our best efforts to make sure there are no issues there. And then we've also fundamentally improved the protocol. And my Discord's dying. Great, thanks, Discord. Can everyone still hear me? Yeah, okay, there we go. Discord decided to restart or something. So what other questions have we got? Do we have to participate in the ARB auction actively, or is the way this can be done passively? So there'll definitely be passive components. There'll be an active auction regardless, unless at the protocol level we have enough money. So this is this implied collateral idea, and if there's resting liquidity for the auction in the passive component that is enough to return us to peg, it will just happen, and there will be no active auction. But the active auction will still be there if those criteria aren't met. But in terms of the passive side of the auction, there will definitely be a passive component. So there's going to be something that we're calling the auction pool, which is a percentage of above peg profits, just like they go through the vesting system and get given to LPs. There will also be another auction pool, which takes some of a smaller percentage, a significantly smaller percentage from the above peg profits. And again, that pool is owned pro rata your LP, just like in the liquidity mine. And then those funds are there purely to defend peg during the auction process. So that's kind of like layer one, kind of like quote unquote a dumb system in that there's no pricing. It's in some sense just infinite liquidity in terms of the spread of that liquidity. There's no, I suppose there's an analogy here between like Uniswap V2 liquidity and Uniswap V3 liquidity, where V3 is concentrated. So this auction pool is going to be like V2, Uniswap V2, where it's not concentrated, it's just spread across all possible auction prices and just distributed accordingly. So that's the kind of first quote-unquote dumb system that will passively participate in the auctions, and then LPs will just get a pro rata share of that. And then there's an order book system that we're working on, which we're still in debate whether this is going to be V2 or V2.5. We're not sure, because it is a bit more complicated to do. But there will be some kind of order book where you can specify exactly where you want to deploy your liquidity, your capital, during the auction. So maybe you only want to commit to the auction if it falls to 70 cents or 80 cents. And so you're kind of going for higher reward, but then you're not going to get filled that regularly, hopefully. Or there may be people who are willing to just bid at like 95 cents or 98 cents and know that the premium's not very high, but their liquidity is very likely to get hit during an auction. And therefore, they're getting smaller profits more regularly as opposed to larger profits more rarely. And that's kind of a game theory situation where people are going to deploy their liquidity where they think, and there's going to be a natural equilibrium point where it's a market-driven thing again, where the price, that premium gets priced automatically based on that limit order book. But then maybe a V3 idea, we're not sure yet, but there could be a system where somewhat, again, like Uniswap V3, there is a way of earning yield on your auction liquidity, if you want to call it that, where you deploy your liquidity into the auction. Let's say I'm going to put $10,000 and I want to deploy it between 92 cents and 95 cents. And in return, much like Uniswap V3, you get a token that represents that liquidity, and then you could potentially put that token into the protocol and earn a yield on it. So then you're earning the yield on just the promise that you will help defend peg, and then you will also earn the actual premium on the auction itself. So then you're kind of doubling down. And then there's a system of incentives there where we need to structure it such that the balance between above peg rewards going to LPs and above peg rewards going to the ARB liquidity providers, and all of that stuff balances out in a strong system of incentives. And that's going to be something that we're working on in the kind of future roadmap for Malt, because we think that kind of system is going to be extremely strong, where there's a natural Schelling point between providing liquidity and staking it versus not providing liquidity to the LP pool, but providing liquidity to the auction. So then instead of having full liquidity in the LP pool, we have the liquidity split between liquidity in the pool and defending the underside of the peg, which additionally adds into this concept of implied liquidity, because now there's a whole bunch of capital that's actually user capital, speculative user capital, that's there to make money. It's there to generate profit, to earn yield for the users, but it is there as a form of collateral, and there will be some kind of guarantee that that money will be there in the case that we lose peg. The specifics of that, extremely fuzzy, and I'm not committing to anything right now, but these are the kinds of things we're thinking about, and how can we put all of the money in the system to use multiple times in a harmonious fashion. And that's the kind of thing that we're thinking about, and that's one of the ideas that we've thrown around and that we think is pretty strong. This kind of dynamic order book where you can stake your liquidity in the auction order book and get rewarded ahead of time for your promise to defend peg. But then there's other issues there where people can just earn the yield and pull the money later, so then we need to work those out. But those are the kinds of things that we think Malt, the far distant future of Malt, that's where we're headed. So what other questions have we got? How confident are you that Malt will be pegged to $1 better in relation to V1? If Malt swings a lot, then further integrations in the protocol are not likely. I mean, Malt V1 isn't a good reference point, I don't think, because before there was any knowledge of a bug, Malt V1 was extremely stable. It didn't deviate very much at all from peg, and when it did, it recovered very quickly. But then the rumors of the bug started circulating, and that's what created the sell-off. So in that sense, there's this conflating factor of the bug, and remove that, it's like we don't know how well Malt V1 performs. I would suspect that it would have held peg for much longer, and then when we lost peg from below, we probably would have seen issues into the auctions, and the process would have been more long and drawn out than it was in V1 in the way that it actually panned out. But in that sense, like, are we trying to make V2 better? Yes, we are, which is effectively what that question's asking. Like, if I could make guarantees that Malt would never break peg, then I would have done it. But we're inherently experimental. We're trying to do something that nobody else has successfully achieved, which is an extremely good, drastically under-collateralized stablecoin. And that's the holy grail of DeFi as far as I'm concerned, and nobody's done it really well yet. I mean, the best attempts is probably Frax, and calling Frax completely algorithmic or anything along those lines is somewhat tenuous. Despite I'm a big fan of Frax, I think Frax is amazing, but it's not comparable to Malt in what we're trying to achieve ultimately, in that they're effectively fully collateralized all the time. Will there be referral incentives? Very unlikely. But yeah, who knows? But we haven't thought about anything along those lines. So I suppose that's about it in terms of the concrete stuff in V2. So we've got the focal vesting, the reward smoothing, implied collateral, which implied collateral is the really big idea, where the statement of being able to make fully collateralized guarantees despite not having full collateral owned by the protocol. That kind of thing is amazing, and that's what we're trying to achieve with implied collateral, and riffing on that idea as much as we possibly can and trying to bring in as much as we can into that. And then the changing of the ARB token risk profile with these various escape hatches from the ARB tokens. Those are, and then I suppose add into that the auction order book, and then this auction liquidity thing, which is more of a 2.5 V3 kind of idea. All of that is the core of what we're thinking about, what we're working on, and what we're hoping is going to make V2 significantly better than V1. And that's about it in terms of that. And then I suppose a few other things to mention is we are working on a rebrand right now, so we're throwing ideas around. So that's another factor that we're going to have to get out the way before we can launch a V2. Got to have a new UI built, new homepage, modernize things, get a new logo done, and just bring us up into the 21st century of DeFi, so to speak. Would there be anything from Ohm that we can utilize in Malt? Something like about the simplicity passive single-sided staking that users can just leave forever might be appealing for people that don't want to deal with complex mechanisms and game theory. I would say Malt is, in some senses, very similar to Olympus DAO. The core mechanism underlying is somewhat similar. We both have some sense of a protocol controlled value. We both have the protocol itself minting and selling. But then we diverge in that they're fully backed. They're one-to-one backed. And one thing I do really like about Olympus DAO, among other things I like the project generally, is that they have the bonding mechanism where you can effectively sell your LP to the protocol, so the protocol accrues LP over time. I think that's an incredibly good idea, and there's a lot of interesting things you can do when the protocol owns a lot of the liquidity. One of those ideas we can see with the Fei protocol, where they have this rebalancing mechanism because they own a ton of the liquidity. In terms of the game theory, like complex mechanisms, we're trying to make it as simple as possible, for sure. And just staking your LP, so you provide liquidity and you stake LP, that's pretty hands-off and simple, and you're going to earn a pretty decent APR doing that. And you're also going to get in V2 some participation in the auctions, which is going to add an additional premium to the earnings that you're making. And at that point, the only complexity is actually providing the liquidity. And we're considering adding in just like user experience, things like being able to zap any coin into a Malt LP position directly from the Malt UI, which would remove the complexity of doing that. And that is something that we care about a lot, which is like just the idea of making it as simple as possible for anyone to participate. Because DeFi, for those of us who are embedded in it and we're deep into it, and I assume that's almost all of you, because I can't imagine there's too many casual observers who are into algorithmic stablecoins on Polygon. So for us, we understand DeFi, we understand these primitives, we know what liquidity providing is, we know what all of these ideas, we've interacted with dApps, we're used to using MetaMask. It's quite simple for us because we've done it over and over and over again. That's not the case for most people. And I've got various friends in real life who are not in crypto, they're not in DeFi, but they wanted to get involved in Malt because it was me that was building it. And that was an educational experience for me, because I realized how much I take for granted and how little the average person knows about the primitives in DeFi. And it's on us as builders and on us as the DeFi community broadly to make it as easy as possible for these people to get involved. Because if we don't make it easy for them, we're never going to reach mass adoption. And the internet became the success it did because the builders iterated on user experience over and over and over again until eventually everything was so solid that anyone can use the internet. And we see that now, where almost everyone is capable of using WhatsApp or sending an email or browsing Amazon or whatever it happens to be. And they have zero understanding of the complexity that happens behind the scenes when they do that. Just a simple HTTP request to like Amazon.com. That's an insanely complex thing that happens, but it's been completely standardized and abstracted away. And we're in that phase right now in DeFi where we all have to build these primitives, and we don't know what they're going to look like ultimately. And different projects are experimenting, and we're all part of that journey. And we get to vote with our money. And the protocols that succeed are the ones that we allocate capital to. And that's an exciting thing to do. And we should all be endeavoring to work on user experience as much as we can, because that's how we win, ultimately. Your voice is so hypnotizing. It's very kind. Thank you. So I think that the only thing that I've got left to say, unless there's other questions, is about the community upgrades. And Mr. KRN here in the AMA questions, he's done a stellar job where he's added a bunch of bots to our Discord, some of which are not public in the main chats yet, but will be. And then we've opened up a lot of these other community channels. And most of them are empty right now because we've just created them all. And we want to encourage people to start using the ones that are interesting to them. And then we'll just close down the ones that people don't want, and we'll double down on the ones that people do want. But we want to encourage as much community participation as possible, where the people who are a lot of other Discords have language-specific channels. We can have those. We want to do like movie nights, poker nights, have discussions about our favorite music. If there's people who like to play music, like to create music, then we can have like malt collaborations. We can do like a malt con like every year or something where people can come and talk about DeFi or even whatever they feel like talking about. And we just want to cultivate a family and an environment where people feel like they're part of something and is helpful and create something that's bigger than we are. And poker nights using malt as buy-ins, yeah, it's not a bad idea. That'd be fun, actually. I'd be really into that. So yeah, just all of these kinds of things where like if people are into gaming, we can do Discord channels where we all like have a gaming night. We all hop on and play a game together, and we're in a voice channel and we just have a good time, and all of these kinds of things. And I also want to encourage people who want to learn more about the specifics of the tech behind DeFi to come in and ask questions, because I'm in a privileged position that like I'm building a DeFi project. I, to some degree, understand the technicals behind DeFi, and I suspect that there's a lot of people who are interested in DeFi because we're all curious people. And if you want to learn more, I want to encourage Malt as being a place where you can come and do that. I'll hop into the areas and answer questions, and maybe over time we can have free boot camps for people who want to learn how to code DeFi projects, or just talks by other DeFi builders about what it's like to build in DeFi, and just provide a good educational platform for people to come and learn about what it is to build DeFi, and so that we can all use our experience of using DeFi protocols and roll that into actually building something. And I think if we all did that, DeFi would be an incredibly nice place to be. And hopefully Malt is a nice place to be as well. And we want to do everything we can to encourage that. So yeah, let us know if there's anything that you want to see us doing. Like we're probably going to try and do some giveaways. I've mentioned this before, but I want to get some NFTs made to commemorate Malt V1, and also offer as kind of community tokens of participation and of just outstanding performance. Like if we see people who are hanging out in the Discord a lot, they're helpful, then we want to recognize that and allow you to show off that you're a key member of the Malt community. And to that end, we're going to introduce this new leveling system where it's role-based, and based on your participation, hanging out, answering questions, coming to events, just generally being a core member of our community, you're going to start progressing through the different levels within our Discord, and we're going to offer various perks and benefits to the people who are in the higher levels of the leveling system. But again, all of this is in flux, and we just want to do it as best as we can for the community. So if the community likes something, doesn't like something, wants something, doesn't want something, whatever it happens to be, just let me know, or KRN, or any of the mods, Felipe, Tony Fomo, anyone, just let us know, and we'll get it done, because ultimately we're here to serve. We're here to build something good, and we're here to build a good community as well as a good coin and a good protocol. So just let us know what you want to see, and we'll do our best to make that happen. A reinvest NFT would be sick. I agree. Yeah, I've thought about that. I've spoken with an artist actually about trying to create something along the lines of reinvest as an NFT. And maybe if we find the time, I want to bury an Easter eggs around the new UI, and maybe we'll offer exclusive perks to the people that find those, and the reinvest button from V1 seems like a good Easter egg to bury in there somewhere. I think that's been an hour now, so if anyone has any more questions, throw them in there. Otherwise, thank you all for coming. I hope you're all excited as excited about V2 as we are, and we are going to try our best to get Malt V2 out and as good as humanly possible, so that we can all have a great time together.